Well, good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome to another of our Managing Your Small Business, now beyond the pandemic, hopefully, webinar series number 77. A series that began at the onset back in March of 2020. We've been doing webinars, more than 77, since January 2013. One of these days, I'm going to count them all up for you. I might be going off with my picture in a few minutes just because the internet's kind of doing some weird stuff this morning, so I'm a little concerned. But again, my name is Kelly Bearden, and I'm the director of the California State University Bakersfield Small Business Development Center. And we are broadcasting live today in downtown Bakersfield. So just a few notes that I want to make sure that you are aware of is the California Relief Grant Program does have new rounds coming up, and we are offering this through the California SBDC program. We are offering webinars, weekly webinars that are done in multiple languages, including Vietnamese, Spanish, Mandarin, and English. So there's the opportunity for you to get in if you haven't before. Many of you have. Many of you I've talked to have received your California Relief Grant between $5,000 and $25,000 and have mentioned how great it was and helpful at the time. So it's still out there, and those webinars are there to kind of assist you. So what's going on today, September 1st, 2021? Well, on the pandemic relief side of things, there's kind of a lot going on with EIDLs. It continues to open and move up and continue on with the process that we've seen and this trend that we've seen over the last few weeks. And with that trend, what we've seen is we've seen much more spending since July 8th. A lot of those are being consumed by the EIDL Advance and the EIDL Supplemental, but most of it is going for larger EIDLs. So if you recall with the EIDL program, we'll give you the information if you want to request a larger one. We're encouraging our clients to do it rather quickly because we don't know how much funding is available. The program is scheduled to run through the end of the year, but as we continue to see a greater and greater potential need because of the pandemic, that it is something that you definitely might want to look at getting a larger EIDL loan in place, the Economic Injury Disaster Loan through the SBA portal. Just mentioned the California Relief Grant is opening up again to new individuals. SBA changes that could continue is something that is rather interesting that we've seen and we've heard talked about. And this came from the SBA administrator, Isabel Casillas Guzman. And Isabel basically had mentioned in an article 3 things that she had saw and hoped might continue. One of those was that we would have potentially a much greater participation by lenders in SBA loans. And that being the fact that before the pandemic, there were about 1,800 SBA lenders. Now there's over 5,000 that have done the PPP loans. So hopefully many of those will stick around and offer products that will also, as she mentioned, hopefully continue with favorable terms. So hopefully we'll see some good terms and maybe smaller loan amounts. One of the issues that we're running into is, of course, for those that are doing traditional SBA funding right now, is the smaller loan amount. And smaller loan amount used to be like 50,000 and under when I was a younger man. But now we're seeing smaller loan amounts are like under 250,000. So continually a problem. And I totally get it from the banks or lenders' perspective, is that you can have $1 million loan or you can have $20,000, $50,000 loans. Obviously, a good $1 million loan is a lot cheaper to service and a lot cheaper to keep up on than 50 of the 20,000. So hopefully that is going to the more favorable terms, and then also more help on the way, continued help in trying to help our small businesses. So those are SBA changes that we're going to keep talking about, and hopefully they will continue. We got a great guest speaker for you today. That's what's up today on September 1st. We've got John McFarland. We'll be introducing him, and this will reflect the second out of the last 3 webinar Wednesdays that we have had HR specialist as our special guest today. So a lot to go over with the changes and the ever changes that keep happening in a lot of those particular areas that employers are concerned with. Employers that I talk to are concerned with potential liability from unvaccinated employees and other things. So a lot of those issues that have kind of been out there for a lot of our small businesses, we'll get those discussed today. I will also give you a very, very quick PPP forgiveness and explain why it's going to be very, very, very short today and other relief programs. And we're going to do our poll. So just as you look forward to the next couple of weeks on Webinar Wednesday, next week, we will not have a guest speaker, and I will do a deeper dive into some of the issues that I talk about today before I introduce John. And those are going to be the items that we just kind of touched on. So next week is going to be a full deep dive. If you have pandemic relief questions, if you have any of because of the way we look at the pandemic relief options that are open to you is they are a resource in managing your business. So we're going to look at it, of course, from the managing your business, managing multiple relief programs, etc. Talk about forgiveness in great detail and take your questions next week on September 8th. And then on September 15th, our scheduled guest is going to be Ken Kagana with the U.S. Patent and Trade Office. And a little bit he's going to be talking about is the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office and the services that they offer, the things that they're doing. A couple of weeks ago, we shared a wonderful webinar that they did on trademark intellectual property for restaurants. And it's a 2-hour collection. We'll bring that out again on the 15th, but it's really something when I jumped into, there are some things that you never really think about in food service and restaurants that could be potential trademarks or even, trade secrets. So IP on that side of things. Now, when we talk about deep dive next week, it will be the latest on managing your employee retention tax credit. Hopefully we'll know more about if it's going to end on the 31st of December or the 30th of September. But as we do every week, we roll along with what we know at the time. We're going to give you a PPP forgiveness update. Right now, there are actually banks and lenders that are using the forgiveness portal through SBA, which I've heard good things about from clients that have used it. Again, that PPP forgiveness is always going to hinge with your lender. So follow your lender and see what your lender has in store for that forgiveness process. If it is through that portal, there are now 1,300 lenders with about 50% of the outstanding unforgiven PPP loans that are basically in the portfolio of those 1,300 lenders. We're going to look at EIDL solutions to the biggest issues, and I do have compiled a list that are the biggest issues that we're seeing. Talk to clients on a weekly basis that are trying to get these issues resolved. The SBA disaster line toll-free number, the people there are extraordinarily helpful and jump in and have seen so many of these different problems. I'm hearing really good feedback from the customer service they're getting from the toll-free number for the SBA disaster loan portal. Of which one thing I didn't mention, and I will probably throw in the deep dive for next week, is that there is an SBA disaster that occurred with the Mountain View fire last November. And that was in northern Mono County and then spread into Nevada, burned about 20,000 acres. If you had an economic injury through that will be discussed a little bit next week, including, ironically, our guest speaker last week who was impacted by that disaster. We're going to talk about some of the program opportunities that still exist, the managing your relief programs that you have, managing them to a successful conclusion, making sure that potential audits or reviews that could be coming down the road and what to do, how to back up and get your information ready, and how to spend the money that you have received properly, and whatever else you want to discuss. Okay, let's jump into the polls real quick. I got 2 quick polls for you. I'm trying to be quick today. I know this is the topic with our HR specialist today that is really popular, and so let me jump to the polls real quick, and I'll launch the first poll here. And it's a poll that we launched 3 weeks ago called The Biggest Fear. And your biggest fear today, not 3 weeks ago, your biggest fear today is getting products to sell. It's harder and harder with that supply chain. Another slow or shutdown, finding employees or retaining them, keeping customers and employees safe. How about something different? How about those darn fires and smoke out here in California? And then anything other than that is your biggest fear at this time, please add in the chat and we'll get to it at the end of today's webinar. So again, the biggest fear today, and maybe next week we'll compare what has changed over 3 weeks from what your biggest fear might have been 3 weeks ago, or those that were on the webinar at that time. So we have about 55% of you that have participated at this point. Your biggest fear is getting products to sell, another slower shutdown, finding, retaining employees, keeping customers and employees safe. Well, that's darn fires and smoke, impacting a lot of outdoor businesses. And then also other, add to the chat, please. So we got 66% of you in. We're going to end the poll at this point. Almost got 70%, but ended at 68%, and share the results with you. And again, the biggest fear, which it was 3 weeks ago, was another slower shutdown. Nearly half of you selected that slow down, and even that's probably even fear with your customer base. 24% of you are still having an issue finding and retaining employees. Maybe even that has gone up since the last one. Other 12%, I can't wait to see those. So please add those to the chat. We had still, most of you are getting your products to sell. Only 5% of you see that as your biggest fear, along with keeping your employees, customers safe, and those darn buyers. So thank you for that particular poll. And let's do a pop quiz type of question for once. We haven't done one of these in a long time. Your pop quiz today is going to be on the size of SBA's loan portfolio. Not something a lot of us think about, how much the SBA's loan portfolio has ballooned during this pandemic. So in a typical year, it's about $40 billion made up of SBA type of loans for starting and growing businesses. So how much is on the books now with the SBA? And your pop quiz today could be either 30 billion, 100 billion, 600 billion, or over $1 trillion. So we started with a portfolio of 40 billion. What's it up to now? Has it reduced to 30 billion? Has it gone up 2.5 times to 100 billion? Has it gone up essentially, 15 times to 600 billion? Or has it gone up over, and that's over 25 times, to over $1 trillion? So jump in, vote once, and jump out, and we will be closing this poll relatively quickly. Again, usually SBA has 40 billion on the books. Is it 30, 100, 60, or excuse me, 600 or $1 trillion? And with about 60% of you in, we're going to close the poll, share the results with you. And your results, you're saying $600 billion. The correct answer is over $1 trillion, 23% of you with the third picked answer. And also 100 billion. That really shows the gravity, of the situation, doesn't it? When your portfolio jumps 25 times in the amount of loans that were done through PPP mostly, and also the EIDL program, that really it jumped. And could be a misleading question. I hear you out there. I know what you're saying. You're saying, what about those loans that are forgiven? But officially, until they're forgiven, they were on the books for over $1 trillion, or maybe they still are, but in a recent article with the administrator, $1 trillion. So we're going with that. Okay, thank you. And thank you for participating. Zoom apparently insists that now I close this wonderful thing and give you its full attention. And we're on to the status action of items and programs. which will really be the focus of next week after we get through this. But you know, the employee retention tax credit it ends either of those 2 dates, and we talked a little bit about EIDL. You know, I've thrown the family leave tax credit up there and never talked about it. I think today is your day, people. Today is the day it's going to happen. We talked about the California Relief Grant Program. We talked about forgiveness, and we talked about how much more. We'll talk about it next week. The Bakersfield Loan to Grant Program, from my understanding, is still open, and you can contact Access Plus Capital here in Bakersfield. Our PPPs are closed, venues are closed, restaurant revitalization closed. The only exception I will say with venues, your shuttered venues, if you received one, the supplemental program is open. Shuttered venues only got about $8 billion in actual awards to eligible venues. The criteria was pretty tight on that. And so they have money that's available, and they recognize that venues are continuing to be impacted by what is going on with the pandemic. So they have reopened that process and will continue to offer up to 50% of their outstanding award for those that have a shuttered venue operator grant. So last week we talked a little bit about problems with COVID around the world, about some saying the supply chains might take to 2023. There's major issues in a lot of the Asian manufacturing areas, and not China, but they could have, I don't know. Small businesses can contribute to manufacturing. That could be part of the problem. We talked a little bit about that last week. This week, the news is coming that Asian factories are getting hammered and expect to supply in higher cost for electronic and apparel. So you might not be able to find some items, and if you do, it might not be at the price you really were expecting. And North Korea rejected 3 million doses of China's Sinovac, citing that other people needed it more than they did. And also, we're seeing a lot of countries around the world that are looking at travel restrictions and actually putting up some travel rules and regulations. And so that's what's going on there. You know a lot about the EIDL changes. You can now increase up to a $500,000 EIDL. And what you do is you can request that EIDL right here. A lot of the EIDL issues that people had that were either declined or running into problems, we've compiled that list, and that'll be part of the deep dive for next week. But really right now, you can at least apply. You might not receive up to $500,000 of an economic injury disaster loan. We mentioned the consumer experience has been improving. As you can tell, a lot of this is going to be discussed next week in great detail. So I'm blowing through it. We talked a little bit about Sba Reviews and conducting audits. All loans over $2 million will be reviewed. We've started to see a number of clients, many of them under $150,000, that have been reviewed or requested additional information. And we'll touch on that a little bit next week. If any of you want to share any information with me, I would love an email on any of this stuff that you might be experiencing, and we will keep your name out of it as we try to do. The new tiers for the California Relief Program. We did mention the SVOG is no longer accepting, but they are now opening the program for those that have received the award. And you can receive potentially 50% of the original award amount that you have capped by 10 million. Next week, definitely we'll know more on the infrastructure bill, and if the infrastructure bill is going to take money away from EIDL and make it more important for you to get out and get your EIDL request for additional funding and other things. And there quickly is your timeline for forgiveness. So you had 24 weeks to use the fund if you elected the covered period for 24 weeks, a 10-month window from the end of the covered period, 60 days for your lender to verify or approve and upload to the SBA portal, and 90 days. So the key thing is if you had an original PPP loan from last year and you got it in April or May and it has not been forgiven, that 10-week window period is either closed or closing rapidly. Now, the good thing is that you can still get PPP forgiveness. It's just you're going to start paying. You're going to start getting invoices and start being required to pay on that amount since none of it had been forgiven. So that is one thing you definitely want to look at and get into. And now I have the distinct pleasure of introducing today's special guest, John McFarland, who I met actually as an attendee. We attended the webinars early on, getting a lot of the pandemic relief, probably to help his clients in his role as a senior development officer for Worklogic, and also how that works into Vensure HR services. But really a great authority on this. John, I'm going to let you take it away and tell more, give more time to you and talk more about a lot of these key HR issues that a lot of employers are dealing with. Thank you for joining us today, John.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So at this point in time, I'll share my screen. Please let me know if you cannot see it advancing. However, here we go. So today's topic, I'll be covering COVID-19 update, what business owners need to know for fall 2021. And as Kelly indicated, this is me, John McFarland. I'm SHRM CP certified. I've been in the PEO industry for a little over 14 years, a little over 20 years in leadership and human resources. I work for Worklogic. I've been in this facility here on California, and I've been with Worklogic for about 14 years, the full time I've been in the PEO industry. And the relationship between Vensure Employer Services and Worklogic, as Worklogic partnered with Vensure back in 2018. And as a result, I transitioned from Director of Operations at this physical location to Senior Vice President of Client Development, which is a strategic team that helps our clients with strategic human resources. We can touch on operations and such. So that's kind of a little bit about me and who I am, where I come from. As I mentioned, we are a division partner of Vensure Employer Services. Vensure Employer Services was founded in 2004. It's one of the largest PEOs in the nation. We're the #1 largest privately held PEO. At present, we're servicing over 350,000 worksite employees. We cover all 50 states, as well as Canada, with a division partner we have in Canada and Puerto Rico. We process a little over 11 billion in payroll at present, 26 division partners across the nation, and more than 40 physical office locations. Today's agenda, what I'm going to cover is some things to consider with respect to your employee handbook, changes in the workplace with respect to COVID-19, and looking at or updating your travel policies. So first, stat updates to your employee handbook. I'm not going to cover this from a specific COVID perspective. Think of it more of an overarching process with the idea in mind that COVID is an infectious disease. It is spread through droplets, but so is flu, so is cold, so is some other things. And granted, prior to 1918, we didn't even understand what flu was. And now it's a normal part of our lives. And hope and pray that at some point COVID will be the same thing, and there will be the XYZ ABC infection of the future that has yet to be discovered or in the forefront. So from a health and safety perspective for your handbook, general hygiene, yes, you can put in the handbook hand washing protocol and procedures. It's a good idea. Shaking hands. This is an interesting one. Through my research, the handshake in business has been part of business since the Roman Empire. And what's interesting is SHRM did a survey a couple months ago, and 72% of respondents indicated that they are no longer comfortable shaking hands because of COVID. So it may be something you may want to at least address in a handbook, that it's okay not to shake hands. In fact, one of the best pieces of advice is advising employees to let the person you're speaking to make the first move, meaning, don't just thrust out your hand for a handshake, give them a moment. If they put their hand out, that means they're okay with the handshake. If you are, go ahead and shake their hand. If they're not, they may give you the wave, keep my distance, or they may simply smile and whatnot. But it's good to address it, because it really puts people in an uncomfortable position sometimes, especially when you're so used to it. I'm a big handshaker and a hugger. It's been difficult for me. So to know this going into it, it's nice to know it's not something I did or said. Utilization of hand sanitizer. It's okay to put that in the handbook, especially if hand washing is not readily available, if you're in a remote position or you travel a lot for work and getting to a restroom is not easy. Protocol on sneeze and cough etiquette. This is a unique one, but you could certainly put a protocol or a policy in your handbook as it pertains to sneeze and cough etiquette. Through my research, realized that sneezes come out at an average of 100 miles an hour. Coughs come out at an average of 50 miles an hour. The gases behind it, specifically to sneezes, can actually cause the droplets to travel up to 27 feet. Additional research, one of the researchers found that droplets that occurred on the first floor of a building ended up on the 10th floor of the building and had enough droplets and microorganisms to actually get somebody sick. I think it takes about 10 to 15, and they found about 100,000. And that traveled through the HVAC system. So it's good to address the fact that if you're going to sneeze, it's not a hachoo at everybody, or even in your hand, because then you touch things, or the half elbow, but the full elbow to cover it up, because it's going to spray everywhere. And then vaccines in the workplace, and I'll cover that in more detail on the following slides. Some other items to consider are leave policies within the handbook. Family Medical Leave Act, or FMLA, if you have 50 or more employees. California Family Rights Act, or CFRA, that actually changed January 1st, 2021. That applies to employers with 5 or more employees. Pregnancy disability leave, 5 or more employees. Any company-specific leaves. Maybe you have a specific policy that's unique to your company. It's good to get that in writing, whether it be in the handbook or a separate policy. Maybe it's just a reference in the handbook to the outside policy, but it's good to have that in writing so it's clear. And then the sick leave policies. You have the California paid sick leave. It's important to have that in your handbook. And I'm not recommending that you put California COVID-19 paid sick leave in your handbook, but there are requirements to advise employees of their rights to that. And that is for 25 employees or more, in effect from 1/1 through September 30th. Now let's get into the vaccinations. So I'm going to approach this from 2 angles. One, the federal position, and then kind of some state samples. So first and foremost, from a federal perspective, there is a case law, Jacobson versus state of Massachusetts, which essentially indicated that states can mandate vaccinations so long as it's in the public interest from a health perspective. That's the case law that tends to be referred to when it comes to vaccine mandates. In May of this year, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, produced FAQs, and in there essentially took the position that, 1, federal laws do not prevent an employer from mandating vaccinations. And they even touched on and indicated that an employer can actually offer an incentive for employees to voluntarily provide proof of vaccinations. They did provide a caveat to that. Don't make the incentive so phenomenal that it would have an employee that would otherwise be uncomfortable providing that information would do so because they simply want that incentive. For example, don't give an all expense paid trip to Bahamas as an incentive. Probably way too extravagant for the circumstance. $25 gift card to your local coffee shop, probably a little bit more in line. Private employers may indicate that vaccinations are required as a condition of employment so long as it is job related and consistent with the business necessity. For example, if you're in healthcare, mandating vaccinations would be consistent and business necessity for the safety of your employees and your patients that you're servicing, especially because many could be vulnerable or immunocompromised. A bad example would be, I don't like germs and therefore I don't want it in my business, so I'm going to mandate it. Probably not a good idea. It's not job related and it's not consistent with business necessity, just as an example. So from the state perspective, California Department of Public Health published a healthcare vaccination requirement, went into effect August 5th, requirement to be completed by September 30th. indicated that those in industries listed, and it was industries or not industry specifics for the healthcare, such as acute healthcare, doctors' offices, drug and alcohol rehab centers, where you have residential facilities, would fall within that category. There's about 6 or 7 specifics. When I looked through it, it didn't look like there was many that weren't included in that. And that is a statement that individuals in the healthcare industry need to be vaccinated. California Department of Public Health also published the vaccine verification for workers in schools. That came out August 12th, and they have till October 15th to comply. It's primarily the TK, K through 12, and that indicates that the school systems need to verify the vaccination status for their employees. Then there's AB 455. It's currently in draft form, and there's some indications in there that if that were to move forward, there could be the so-called vaccination passport, meaning you want to go to a bar, a restaurant, a sporting event, you're going to need to provide proof of vaccinations. But what's also in it was an indication that employers are going to be mandated to verify that vaccinations for the employees. And that's for those that are job applicants, current employees, et cetera, as well as it indicated an additional 24 hours of sick. So again, that's in draft form. The state legislature is looking to possibly address that prior to September 10th, because I guess they go on break and won't be back till January, which by the time we have gone all through fall. So keep an eye on that, because there is some provisions in there for employers if it does pass. So where does that leave the state of California? State and municipalities do not prohibit an employer from mandating vaccinations. And that's the reason for some of those examples. That's what the state's doing right now. So what does this leave? It leaves the federal standards and case laws that pertains to vaccinations, both of which point to the fact that a business can mandate vaccinations. So where does that leave a business? Really, it comes down to a business decision. So what are some things to consider with respect to that decision? First off, what's the reason for mandating the vaccinations? Is it consistent with the job duties and business necessity? It's important to make sure you have that distinction. If you decide to move forward with it, what are some policy considerations, such as when must employees be vaccinated? Now, 30 days from now, 60 days, 90 days? What's acceptable proof? Is it the CDC card only? Or is it a written attestation from the employee that says, yep, I'm vaccinated, don't worry about it? And who's going to maintain that documentation? Now you're dealing with medical documentation. And under HIPAA, it needs to be handled in a very specific way. So whomever is running that program for your organization, you need to make sure that they understand how to properly manage and hold that information in confidentiality according to HIPAA. And how will requests for sincerely held religious beliefs or medical accommodations be handled? While it indicates that an employer can mandate, the employer still needs to be open to the fact that you're going to have exceptions for those that are with sincerely held religious beliefs and or medical accommodations. And then how are you going to maintain morale? This is a real important question to understand, because one thing's for sure, our country is polarized. And chances are, if you have even a handful of employees, you probably have those that are very pro-vaccination, those that are very anti-vaccination, and those that kind of fall in the middle, haven't really chosen a side, and they don't need to, obviously. But how are you going to maintain morale? Because really, no matter what decision you make, and it sounds cynical, but you're not going to make everybody happy. So you got to make the decision that's in the best interest of all employees for the most part, as well as possibly your customers. And then how are you going to maintain non-discriminatory actions? And what I mean by that is, let's say, for instance, you have an older employee that you really care about, and you think it's in their best interest to stay home. So you tell them, hey, stay home. I don't want you in the workplace because I don't want you to get sick. And from the heart, that sounds really, really fantastic. But that person may absolutely hate being home. They may have a spouse that nags them while at home. They may have the next door neighbor playing the drums all day long and they can't concentrate at home. And what many have actually indicated is they don't feel they're in a position to make important decisions when they're not in the office. And they feel they may be passed up for promotion, or overlooked for certain projects and such because they're no longer in your eye, if you will, within the workday. So it's important to consider that a good deed may turn out to be considered discriminatory. So be cautious. Next item is changes in the workplace. So first off, with respect to COVID-19, under Title 8, Section 3203, every employer shall establish, implement, and maintain an effective injury and illness prevention program, or IIPP. This has been in place since 1999. IIPP fines range from $500 up to $12,000 based on severity and frequency. Typically speaking, you have an IIPP, you keep it simple, and then add to that IIPP programs that are very specific to your industry or to the hazards within your particular place of employment. One item that was added is the COVID-19 Prevention Emergency Temporary Standards. It was effective November 30th, 2020, and it was recently revised effective June 17th. Sections 3205 through 3205.4 have been updated. Some of the highlight items that have changed, there's been a change in testing and quarantine standards for vaccinated employees. It pretty much indicated that if the employee is vaccinated and they've been exposed, but they do not have symptoms, they're not required to quarantine nor get tested. There's been changes to face coverings outdoors. There's been changes to face coverings indoors for those that are fully vaccinated. However, recent CDC recommendations has indicated that you should continue to have face coverings while indoors, even if you're fully vaccinated. So it kind of goes a little bit against that. I would err on the side of caution and maintain the face coverings for better protection. And then no physical distancing or barrier requirements regardless of vaccination status. There are some exceptions for outbreaks, but for the most part, they've taken the position of the physical distancing and the barrier requirements being no more. And then additional changes in the workplace. I-9 flexibility due to the pandemic and the need for employees to work at home. Department of Homeland Security indicated that one can view identification electronically, and that has been extended. It just came out yesterday through December 31st. What's important to understand here is that pertains to those individuals that are not working physically in the office due to COVID precautions, not because they're a remote employee. That does not apply in that situation, so be careful there. Families First Coronavirus Response Act, or FFCRA, that expires September 30th. As I understand it, there's been a lot of questions regarding this, so I'm going to go a little bit more in depth here. So I'll pause and go into that. So first off, Families First Coronavirus Response Act was part of the CARES Act back in 2020. It ended in December, but was extended under the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021 through March of this year. And then it was further extended through September of this year under the American Rescue Plan Act. What's important to understand is in 2020 up through December, it was mandated for employers that had 1 to 499 employees. For 2021, the extension under both, it's voluntary. It's a choice. If you choose to continue to offer it, what's been changed to a certain degree is you have to offer it to everybody equally, not the people I choose. And it needs to be offered completely, meaning I just want to give 8 hours and call it a day. But the credits are still available for wages paid through September 30th, if that choice was there. Where this really became popular again is when the state of California enacted the COVID-19 sick for COVID reasons. There's no tax credit for that, but there is the tax credit for FFCRA. And the language under the state indicated that if you offer another plan, so long as it is at least equal to the state's process, you can go ahead and utilize that and consider it running concurrent. So a lot adopted to continue to use FFCRA because they got the tax credit. And then they were able to reduce that COVID-19 sick by the amount that they're paying under FFCRA. Trying to think what else is pertinent to FFCRA. There were 6 reasons previously. Under, I believe it was the American Rescue Plan Act, they added 3 additional reasons, and really they pertain to the vaccination. Employee can utilize it to get a vaccination. They can use it if they have complications due to a vaccination or illness from the vaccination. And I believe the 3rd reason was helping somebody in that situation where they got vaccinated and they're sick. So now instead of 6 criteria to qualify, there's 9. COBRA subsidies. COBRA subsidies are available to assistance eligible individuals, or AEIs, and those are individuals that are qualified for COBRA from April 30th through September, or sorry, April 1st through September 30th. And that applies to both federal COBRA and states mini COBRA. So if they're under California's mini COBRA, it would apply. And what essentially that indicates is that the employer is responsible to pay the premium from April through September, and they can recoup those dollars by way of a tax credit. That does end at the end of this month. Payroll protection program, it expired 5/30, as I know Kelly has gone over. There are still many out there utilizing it and or looking at the forgiveness of it. And then the employee retention tax credit, at present, it's set to expire 12/31, but under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, it is possible that it could end at the end of Q3, with the exception of recovery startup businesses that may still be eligible in Q4 if that goes through. And then updating travel policies. This is specific to COVID. It's not necessarily recommended that you update your policy permanently, but you may need to touch on these, and there are some aspects that you could put in a policy permanently. So first off, it's important for employees that must travel to understand the guidelines for vaccinated versus unvaccinated travelers. I just read an article today that 5 European airlines have now indicated that they have banned cloth face coverings and indicated that it must be a surgical covering. So it's very fluid, changes often. Federal mask mandates are important to understand. I was on the West Coast or East Coast through most of August presenting. And for instance, you go to Florida, and Florida's stance is what COVID, come on down and party. So those folks leaving Florida going to say Los Angeles need to understand that while you travel, you need to have the mask on, even though you're not required in the state you are coming from. Federal social distancing, it's not as enforced as the masks, but it is in place. Personal hygiene, it's important to touch base on that, and that is something that you can certainly update permanently in a travel guidelines, simply because it doesn't protect just against COVID, but flu, colds, in the future, virus of who knows what. And then establish travel protocols with respect to following up and looking at state and destination specifics as it pertains to COVID-19 restrictions. I specifically mentioned LA because LA about a month ago indicated that within the county, they put the mask mandate back in place. So somebody coming from Florida, example, traveling for business to LA needs to understand before they get there, they're going to be required to wear a mask. Additional requirements to review current and state local travel advisories is also a good idea to have within a travel policy. And again, that's because it is fluid, it is ever changing. When I looked at Florida, there was nothing, but when I looked at New York, it indicated that I would be required to fill out a health questionnaire and turn it in before exiting the airport, or be subject to a $10,000 fine. So it's important that those that travel understand what may occur on the other end when they get there. So it's important to address that. And at this point, we'll be open for questions.
Thank you, John.
My pleasure.
Let me just grab the first one that was emailed to me. And that is, can employees that leave because they did not get a vaccination, and they didn't specify if they just quit or if they were terminated, but can an employee that leaves because of not getting vaccinated collect unemployment?
I think it would depend on the circumstances. for instance, there are some municipalities that have indicated, or not just municipalities, but, for instance, New York Presbyterian had taken a position of you will be mandated or you will be fired. I think it's going to depend on the circumstance. If an employee has chosen to leave rather than get vaccinated, I think an employer is going to have a stronger case to fight that unemployment because it was a choice, but it's really going to come down to how was it administered, how was it presented, and what was the true reason? Because sometimes employees quit and they don't really give a reason. Maybe it was because of a sincerely held religious belief that they did not indicate. They may be awarded the unemployment in that case. It's really a case-by-case basis.
Okay, also jumping into the Q&A box, and there's still time to ask John a question. There are some related to some of the pandemic programs. We'll jump on those at the end, but we'll stick with what we're talking about now. And jumping into the first question in the Q&A box, and if you put it in chat, that's fine, we'll hit those too. But how do employers handle the medical and or religious exemption?
Typically, you need to get into the interactive process, which is the employer sits down with the employee. You've indicated that due to a sincerely held religious belief or a medical condition, you cannot be vaccinated. What can we do to accommodate that? And sometimes that accommodation could be face covering and social distancing. Sometimes that accommodation could be working from home as a reasonable accommodation. It just depends on the circumstances and what the employer can accommodate with respect to that. But it's important to engage in the interactive process. It's important to document it. And it's important to, for lack of better words, always have the last word, meaning don't let the employee be the last word to the employer. Make sure the employer always responds.
Okay, great. Okay, and a follow-up to that is if it's mandated, and I assume they mean the vaccine, how is that a business decision?
If the business decision is to mandate, for example, it's in the healthcare industry, and if they've taken that position and they said we will require vaccinations, then that's the position of that particular business. But the business needs to be open to the fact that you potentially can have those with sincerely held religious beliefs that won't get vaccinated, or due to some sort of medical condition won't get vaccinated. So you need to have the forethought of what you're going to do in that particular situation. Hopefully that answers the question.
Mm-hmm. And I would even follow up with that. I would, at least from my standpoint, thinking of it as a business decision, I would mandate a vaccination policy for a variety of reasons. Number one might be I might have 3 customers that are my total 3 customers for my entire business. And 2 of those have come to me and said, we have considerable interaction with your employees, and if they're not mandated, we're taking our business elsewhere. That could be, I would think, a good enough reason to mandate vaccinations. And correct me if I'm wrong. But also, I think other things that would make it a business decision, but that's one example that I would use.
Yeah, that could be. Really, the language is that it's consistent with business necessity. And that is kind of a broad brush stroke of a statement, but make sure it's articulated for the reason why mandated versus not mandated.
And if 2/3 of my business is going away, that would be a necessity on my part.
You'd have no business thereafter.
In order to document that and mandate it as being essential.
Yep.
Next question. What is California's current policy in terms of paying employees who are sick with COVID or have been exposed?
Under California, there's the COVID-19 sick leave, so long as they are out due to a COVID reason. And for the most part, it mirrors the Families First Coronavirus Response Act reasons, or FFCRA. So it's still in effect, but for those that are 25 employees or more. So it's something that you would need to provide. The state also has the required sick that's been in place for a few years now. Assuming the employee still has some of that available, they'd have that available as well if they exhaust the COVID sick.
Should you require the COVID vaccination as a requirement for all positions?
If you're going to mandate it, I would mandate it across the board, because you're going to get in that situation of, well, they have to do it, but I don't, or I have to do it, but they don't. When it comes to implementing policies, it's better to go across the board. Now, could you theoretically have a situation where some are and some aren't? You certainly could. Let's say you're in a clinical situation and you've got a back office that enters through a rear entrance and they have zero exposure to patients because of the way the layout is. Theoretically, yeah, they probably don't need to be mandated because they have zero contact with patients. But look at it more from the perspective of, we're not doing it to protect patients specifically, but we're doing it to protect all. And we do have access to the back office, and we want to protect them as well as us. Is probably the best position. But I would say, if you're going to mandate it for all.
And we have 3 questions from 3 different attendees, all on the religious accommodations. And the first one is, in respects to religious accommodations in the healthcare industry, what type of documentation is needed for the employee to continue working without a vaccine?
That's a tough position when it comes to sincerely held religious beliefs. I would definitely partner with your legal counsel, because it can get a little dodgy. Who am I, or who are you to say what's sincerely held and what's not, and what's a religious belief and what's not? I think when you start getting into the gray area, to me, a medical accommodation is a little bit more black and white than a sincerely held religious belief. But definitely partner with your legal counsel and take it from there would be the best advice.
Along the same vein, what religions qualify as religious accommodations to decline a vaccination?
Yeah.
So is there
yeah,
a list?
There is not a list. So again, I mean, that's why it's imperative that you partner with your legal counsel when it comes to sincerely held religious beliefs, because, and I want to say, there was a previous, case, and it didn't have to do with vaccinations, where somebody said they had a sincerely held religious belief where they had to eat cat food, and employees were complaining about cat food being eaten while at work. So you've got some unique religious beliefs out there, and really don't go it alone. Seek legal counsel.
I will pass on the bad tasted joke there and move on to the next question. In a healthcare setting, if it is mandated, do employees who are under the religious exemptions need to be tested weekly?
It did have specifics within the California Department of Public Health notice. Off the top of my head, as I recall, they are required to have a surgical mask or greater while on the premises at all times. If I recall, there was a requirement, though don't quote me on it. But if you research or if you just look up California Department of Public Health, healthcare, I'm trying to remember what it was in exactly the way I had it in the slide deck, and the slide deck is available if you need it. I put the link in there as well. But if you Google that, it has the specifics that must be followed.
And this week we will be sending out as an email attachment the copy of this webinar, your slide deck, and some of the stuff in the chat and resources that we talked about today.
Perfect. So the link is on that slide page.
A full email out later. Yeah. And moving on with the questions, and keep asking John these tough questions. I like it when you ask somebody else stuff.
It's a hot topic.
So keep them coming. A follow-up question to that last one was vaccinations exempted employees who are mandated by state to take COVID tests. If they are mandated to take COVID tests, is there any determination on who should pay for the test, the employee, the employer, et cetera?
I cannot remember off the top of my head if it indicated it within the order, but typically speaking, in the state of California, when something's required from an employment perspective, the expense falls onto the employer. I would read the order. If it specifies, then it's there. If it doesn't specify, I would plan on being the one subject to it, but definitely partner with legal counsel if it's going to be something that's a major financial burden. Hopefully it's not too many, majority of folks probably will not fall within the sincerely held religious belief or medical accommodation with respect to not getting that mandated vaccination. So hopefully it's just a handful and it's not cost prohibitive.
Great. Can an employer in healthcare not mandate the vaccine?
According to the California Department of Public Health, if they fall outside of one of the specific areas they listed, and again, there was like 6 or 7 specific areas. And when I read through it, I was of the belief that I don't know what's then outside of it. It was pretty comprehensive. You'd be required to adhere to it. If you're not within the listed, you'd be comfortable that you're not, but double check that list. Make sure you either are or are not.
Okay, next question. Are there any suggestions on how a parent can handle COVID notices from schools?
Say that again, you were breaking up a little bit.
Okay. Is there any suggestion on how parents can handle once they receive a COVID notice from their school? So any suggestions on what they can do, what a parent can do when receiving a notice, I guess, from either a positive test or other issue at the school?
I'm not too sure I get the question. I think, if we're talking from an employment perspective and the child now has to stay home under FFCRA, if the employer is offering it, and I believe it is one of the items under the COVID-19 paid sick for the state of California, then taking care of someone at home is a criteria that could qualify for the pay under that particular sick policy, but double check with the employer. If you're talking more from the perspective of what should I do with my child, I'll tell you as a parent, if I got a notification from my kid's school that there's been exposure, I'm going to keep my child home to protect them as best I can, because children under 12 cannot get vaccinated. They are still subject to getting sick, and do everything we can not to get them sick.
Okay, I think you're off the old proverbial SBDC hot seat there, John. I don't see any other questions.
I love it. I love it.
Look. So let me tackle a few of these pandemic relief questions, and we'll call it a webinar. Can you apply for and receive the California Relief Grant more than once? And the question is no. If you've already received it, the new rounds that are opening up are only for those individuals who have not accessed it yet. Now, one thing that we did hear when they were running out of money for some of the earlier rounds is that people received less than the full amount. So they thought they qualified for 15,000 and received 5. What I would do is I would contact Lendistry.com and see if there is an opportunity for you to receive the full amount if you received less than what you think your amount was that you could have possibly received. Our poll question about what are some of the other uses, and one of them is personal and health given considerations. So yeah, what keep you awake at night, or your biggest fear is actually personal and family health. And a shout out to my 88-year-old mother, Ellen. Ellen, stay home. Crying out loud. We see a lot of resources that are in the chat. Feel free to grab those. Those were put in by Maureen Busher-Dang, our producer. Thanks, Maureen, and getting those in there. Here's a forgiveness question. Regarding forgiveness, does anyone have experience in calculating the forgiveness period wages? Is it simply 1 month, 2 for 24 weeks? So for the wages, it would be the actual amount that you have expenditured, that your actual expenditure for each of your employees during that period. So what it would be is it would be the gross amount that you pay for that particular employee. So looking through the questions, trying to get a few more here. Are there guidelines for PPP forgiveness for funds received from the state or federal government that are excluded? Their guidelines? Well, there are eligible expenditures for PPP forgiveness. We will jump on those next week, all of the eligible ones, and they have changed. A number of these programs have changed since they first rolled out. PPP first rolled out in April of 2020. We had a significant update and change in the procedures and laws on June the 5th. Mainly the big thing was they're going from 8 to 24 weeks on a covered period. A number of other changes though that were enhanced by the PPP Flexibility Act. Then at the end of the year, the Economic Injury Act on 12/27, 2020, and then also other changes this year. So there've been tons of changes, and have been changes on some of the things that you can actually claim as a eligible PPP expenditure. So we'll get into that in much more detail next week. And that looks like it. That's it for this week. Well, big thanks to John McFarland. John, it was great to have you on.
Thank you.
It looks like we had you on right time too. A lot of great questions, a lot of uncertainty out there. We're in a place a lot of people didn't think we would be in, and here we are. So thank you for coming on and getting a lot of those questions answered today.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm very passionate about education. Thank you for the opportunity.
So great. Well, that'll do it for number 77. We'll be back next week, the deep dive, 79 the following week. So for John McFarland, I'm Kelly Bearden. Have a great day. We'll see you next week, everybody. Goodbye now.